The Supermarine Spitfire didn't just win battles, it saved an entire nation from invasion. Pilots flew it with broken bones, designers drew it in secret sheds, and one plane even landed itself without a pilot. These are 20 weird facts about the Supermarine Spitfire. And the bonus, let's just say this fighter was almost called something completely ridiculous. Strap in, this flight through history is about to get intense. Cost less than a house. One Spitfire cost about 2,500 British pounds to build in 1940, which sounds like a lot. But that was actually less than a nice house in London at the same time. Today, that would equal about $800,000 when you account for inflation over 80 years. The British government started a program where towns, businesses, and even individuals could buy a Spitfire. Entire communities raised money through bake sales, concerts, and donations to sponsor their own plane. The plane would have their town name painted on the side as a thank you. Over 1,500 Spitfires were funded this way by patriotic citizens giving whatever they could afford. Some were paid for by colonial countries like India, Jamaica, and South Africa supporting Britain. One wealthy woman named Lady Lucy Houston donated money for early Spitfire development in 1931. Without her 100,000-pound donation, the Spitfire might never have been built at all. She literally saved Britain with her checkbook years before the war even started. Could fly higher than Mount Everest, the Spitfire could climb to over 40,000 feet altitude, which is higher than Mount Everest's peak at 29,000 feet. At that incredible height, the air is so thin that humans can't breathe without oxygen masks. Pilots wore special pressurized suits and heated clothing because temperatures dropped to 60 degrees below zero. The wings could ice over in seconds, and the controls became stiff and hard to move. Special high-altitude versions of the Spitfire had extended wingtips that were even longer for better performance. These planes intercepted German reconnaissance planes, flying photographic missions over Britain. The flights were so cold that pilots sometimes got frostbite on their fingers and toes despite heated suits. One pilot, Flight Lieutenant Emmanuel Gallatsine, flew a special Spitfire to 50,000 feet in 1943. He said the sky turned completely black and he could see the curve of the Earth. Flying that high in a tiny fighter plane was like being an astronaut decades before spacecraft existed. Some were launched from ships. The Royal Navy modified some Spitfires to launch from aircraft carriers in the middle of the ocean. These special versions were called Seafires and had folding wings to fit in the carrier's tight hangars below deck. They also had a tail hook to catch arresting wires when landing on the short carrier deck. Landing a Spitfire on a moving ship deck was incredibly dangerous and difficult to do successfully. The narrow landing gear made the plane tip over easily, damaging the wings and propeller. Many Seafires crashed into the ocean or smashed into the carrier deck during attempted landings. Pilots had to land at exactly the right speed and angle, or they would die. Despite the problems, Seafires flew combat missions protecting convoys and attacking enemy positions from the sea. They served throughout the war and even into the 1950s on Royal Navy carriers. The Seafire proved the Spitfire design was so good it could be adapted for almost any mission. One rammed a German bomber. On September 15, 1940, pilot officer Ray Holmes ran out of ammunition while attacking German bombers over London. He made an instant decision to ram his Spitfire directly into a German Dornier bomber. Holmes aimed his wing at the bomber's tail, cutting it completely off in a huge collision. Both planes tumbled toward the ground out of control as pieces flew everywhere. Holmes bailed out of his destroyed Spitfire and parachuted safely into a London street. The German bomber crashed into the forecourt of Victoria Station, destroying the building but killing no civilians. Holmes survived with minor injuries and became an instant national hero across Britain. His Spitfire crashed in a different part of London and was completely destroyed on impact. The remains of his plane were eventually recovered decades later from a building site in 2004. Ray Holmes lived to age 90 and died in 2005, always proud of his desperate ramming attack. Spitfires still fly today. About 60 Spitfires are still in flying condition around the world today, over 80 years after they were built. These precious aircraft are maintained by dedicated teams who spend thousands of hours keeping keeping them airworthy. Flying a Spitfire costs over $10,000 per hour due to expensive fuel, maintenance, and insurance costs. Wealthy collectors and aviation museums own most of the flying examples that still take to the skies. The planes perform at air shows around the world, thrilling crowds with their distinctive engine sound. Pilots who fly them today say it's like traveling back in time to World War II. The aircraft require constant maintenance because parts are no longer manufactured anywhere. Mechanics fabricate custom parts by hand using original blueprints and techniques from the 1940s. Some Spitfires have been flying continuously for over 80 years without ever being permanently grounded. Watching one fly overhead still brings tears to the eyes of veterans who flew them in combat. Faster than early jets. The Spitfire kept getting faster throughout the war as engineers improved the design constantly. The fastest version ever built could reach 454 miles per hour in level flight in 1944. That was faster than some early jet aircraft that came out at the end of the war. The Spitfire Mark XIV could dive even faster, reaching over 600 miles per hour in a steep dive. At those extreme speeds, the controls became incredibly heavy and hard to move with human strength. Some pilots couldn't pull out of dives because they weren't strong enough to pull back the control stick. The plane would sometimes rip apart from the stress of such high speeds in the air. Engineers constantly reinforced the airframe to handle the increasing power and speed of new engines. Test pilot Jeffrey Quill flew many of these high-speed test flights, risking his life to find the plane's limits. He survived the entire war despite flying the most dangerous experimental versions of the Spitfire, named after a nasty insult. The Spitfire got its name from a really weird place that nobody expected. Designer Reginald Mitchell hated the name at first and thought it sounded absolutely terrible. The chairman of Vickers, Sir Robert McLean, chose the name because his daughter was called a Little Spitfire when she had a temper tantrum. Mitchell wanted to call it something more dignified and professional sounding. He told his team it's the sort of bloody silly name they would choose when he first heard it in 1936, but the name stuck forever and became one of the most famous aircraft names in all of history. Mitchell died in 1937 from cancer before seeing his plane become a legend. He never knew that his silly named fighter would save Britain and become loved by millions of people around the world for generations. Designed in a wooden shed. Reginald Mitchell designed the Spitfire in a small wooden shed in Southampton, England during the early 1930s. The shed was cold, drafty, and leaked rainwater through holes in the old roof during storms. He worked with just a small team of engineers using pencils, paper, and basic drawing tools. There were no computers, no fancy software, just brilliant minds solving impossible problems with math and imagination. Mitchell was already dying from cancer while designing the plane, but refused to stop working. He knew Britain desperately needed a modern fighter plane to defend against growing threats from Germany. The shed still exists today as a historical landmark that people can visit. Tourists stand inside and can't believe that one of history's greatest fighter planes was born in such a humble, tiny building. Mitchell drew every curve and line, knowing he was racing against both time and his own failing health. The wings were elliptical for a reason. The Spitfire's beautiful elliptical wings weren't just pretty to look at, they were pure genius engineering. The unique shape gave the plane the thinnest possible wings while still being incredibly strong. This special design reduced air resistance, making the Spitfire faster than almost any other fighter in the sky. Engineer Beverly Shenstone calculated the perfect elliptical shape using complex mathematics that took months to figure out. The wings were incredibly difficult and expensive to build because every piece had to be custom made. Each wing took over 1,000 hours of skilled labor to construct by hand in the factory. Factory workers had to be specially trained just to build these complicated wings correctly. The elliptical shape meant the Spitfire could turn tighter and faster than enemy planes in dogfights. German pilots respected and feared those distinctive wings when they saw them coming. Many aviation experts still call them the most beautiful wings ever put on any aircraft in history, built by unlikely workers. When World War II started in 1939, Britain desperately needed thousands of Spitfires built quickly. Factories hired women, teenagers, and elderly men who had never built airplanes before in their lives. These unexpected workers became incredibly skilled at their jobs in just weeks of training. Women assembled the wings, installed the guns, and even test flew the finished planes to airfields. Some workers were as young as 14 years old, lying about their age to help the war effort. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week in dangerous factory conditions with little pay. German bombs often often hit the factories at night, killing workers and destroying partially built planes. The workers would clean up the rubble in the morning and keep building more Spitfires by afternoon. One famous worker, a woman named Lettice Curtis, delivered over 400 Spitfires to RAF bases during the war. These ordinary people became heroes by building over 20,000 Spitfires that saved their country from invasion. Powered by a Rolls-Royce engine, the Spitfire was powered by the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which was a masterpiece of engineering. This engine produced over 1,000 horsepower, which was absolutely incredible for the 1930s and 1940s. The same company that made luxury cars for rich people also made the engine that saved democracy. The Merlin engine had 12 cylinders arranged in a V shape and could run for hundreds of hours without braking. It was so well designed that it powered multiple famous aircraft, including the P-51 Mustang and Lancaster bomber. The engine was constantly improved throughout the war, getting more powerful with each new version. By 1945, some versions produced over 2,000 horsepower, double the original power output. The distinctive sound of the Merlin engine became the sound of freedom across Europe during World War II. German soldiers learned to fear that specific engine roar when they heard it overhead. Rolls-Royce built over 150,000 Merlin engines during the war at multiple factories working around the clock. The fuel tank was in front of the pilot. The main fuel tank sat directly in front of the pilot, right between him and the enemy guns. If an enemy bullet hit that fuel tank, it would explode into flames instantly, burning the pilot alive. This terrifying design flaw killed and injured hundreds of British pilots during the Battle of Britain in 1940. Pilots knew about the danger but flew anyway because their country desperately needed them in the air. Many pilots suffered horrible burns on their faces and hands when their planes caught fire. Dr. Archibald McIndoe performed pioneering plastic surgery on burned Spitfire pilots at East Grinstead Hospital. These burned pilots called themselves the Guinea Pig Club because they were testing new medical procedures. Later versions of the Spitfire moved some fuel to the wings and added better fire protection, but early war pilots took off every day knowing they might burn to death before landing. Their incredible courage and sacrifice is hard for modern people to truly understand or appreciate. 8 machine guns in the wings. Early Spitfires had 8 303 caliber machine guns built into the wings, 4 in each side. They fired 1,200 bullets per minute combined when the pilot pressed the trigger button. The guns were positioned to create a concentrated point of fire about 250 yards ahead of the plane. This cone of fire could shred an enemy bomber or fighter in just a 2-second burst. The guns were loaded with a mix of regular bullets, armor-piercing rounds, and incendiary tracers. Pilots only had about 15 seconds of total ammunition before running completely out. They had to aim carefully and fire in short, controlled bursts to make every bullet count. Ground crews spent hours after each flight reloading all 8 guns by hand with ammunition belts. In freezing weather at high altitude, the guns sometimes froze and stopped working completely. Later versions replaced some machine guns with 20mm cannons that fired explosive shells instead of bullets. More survived than any other Wo-2 fighter. More Spitfires survived to the present day than any other World War II fighter aircraft. Around 240 Spitfires still exist in museums, collections, and private hangars around the world. About 60 of those still fly regularly at air shows and special events for the public. Compare that to other famous fighters like the German Messerschmitt Bf 109, which has fewer than 10 flying examples. The reason so many Spitfires survived is because they served for years after World War II ended. Some countries like India and Israel flew Spitfires until the 1960s in their air forces. This meant the planes were maintained and preserved rather than scrapped like most wartime aircraft. Britain also kept many as trainers and gate guards at RAF bases throughout the 1950s and beyond. When collectors started preserving warbirds in the 1960s, many Spitfires were still around to save. Today, wealthy collectors pay millions of dollars for a restored flying Spitfire in perfect condition. Fought on every front, the Spitfire fought in every major battle and theater of World War II around the entire globe. They defended Britain during the Battle of Britain in 1940, fighting over English cities and countryside. They flew in the deserts of North Africa, where sand-damaged engines and extreme heat caused problems. Spitfires fought in the freezing cold of Russia after being sent to help the Soviet Union. They protected the island of Malta in the Mediterranean, which was bombed constantly by Italian and German planes. Spitfires flew from jungle airstrips in Burma, fighting against Japanese forces in the Pacific. They supported the D-Day invasion in 1944. 1944, providing air cover for soldiers landing on Normandy beaches. Some Spitfires even flew in Australia, defending against Japanese attacks in the early war. No other fighter plane served in so many different places and conditions around the world. Pilots had to adapt to flying in deserts, jungles, frozen tundra, and over oceans during their service. Over 20,000 were built. Britain built 20,351 Spitfires between 1938 and 1948, making it one of the most produced British aircraft ever. At peak production in 1944, factories built over 300 Spitfires every single month without stopping. The planes were built in multiple factories across Britain, including underground facilities hidden from German bombers. Castle Bromwich factory alone built over 12,000 Spitfires during the war with 10,000 workers. The main Supermarine factory in Southampton was bombed by Germany in 1940, killing over 100 workers. Production moved to secret locations, including a converted garage and dispersed workshops around the countryside. Workers assembled planes in small groups, then transported the pieces to final assembly locations by truck. This dispersed production meant Germany couldn't destroy Spitfire production with bombing raids. Some factories operated 24 hours a day with 3 shifts of workers building planes non-stop. The incredible production effort was as important to winning the war as the plane's design itself. 24 different major versions. The Spitfire had 24 different major versions called marks, produced during its service life. Each version had improvements to engines, weapons, armor, and equipment based on combat experience. The Mark I that fought in 1940 looked similar to the Mark 24 from 1946, but they were completely different planes. Engine power more than doubled from 1,000 horsepower to over 2,000 horsepower in just 6 years. Early versions had 8 machine guns, while late versions had 4 powerful cannons instead. Some versions were designed as photo reconnaissance planes with cameras instead of guns. These spy planes flew unarmed over enemy territory, relying on speed and altitude for survival. Fighter bomber versions carried bombs and rockets to attack ground targets and ships. Pilots joked that the only original parts on late war Spitfires were the data plates with serial numbers. The constant evolution kept the Spitfire competitive against newer enemy fighters throughout the entire war. The youngest Spitfire pilot. The youngest Spitfire pilot was probably 18-year-old pilots who joined straight from training, but one of the most famous young pilots was Ray Holmes, who was 24 in 1940. However, there were even younger pilots who lied about their age to join the RAF early. Some pilots were as young as 17 when they first flew Spitfires in combat during desperate times. The average age of Battle of Britain. Pilots was just 20 years old in the summer of 1940. These young men faced experienced German pilots who had been fighting since 1936 in Spain. Many didn't survive their first week of combat due to inexperience and overwhelming enemy numbers. Flight training was shortened from years to just months as Britain desperately needed pilots quickly. Young pilots went from flying training planes to deadly combat in Spitfires within weeks. Those who survived became incredibly skilled very quickly through brutal trial by fire in the sky. Featured in countless movies, the Spitfire has appeared in over 100 movies since the 1940s, more than almost any other aircraft. The most famous appearance was in the 1969 film Battle of Britain, which used 27 real Spitfires. That movie had the largest collection of flying Spitfires gathered together since World War II ended. Dunkirk in 2017 featured beautifully filmed aerial sequences with real flying Spitfires over the English Channel. Director Christopher Nolan insisted on using real planes instead of computer graphics for authentic realism. The 2018 film First Man even included Spitfires in scenes about test pilots after the war. Documentaries about World War II almost always include Spitfire footage because it's so iconic and recognizable. The plane symbolizes British resistance, courage, and ultimate victory against overwhelming odds during desperate times. Film composers always include its distinctive engine roar in soundtracks to evoke emotion and nostalgia. The Spitfire became more than a weapon. It became a permanent symbol of freedom in popular culture. Winston Churchill's favorite Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, absolutely loved the Spitfire and called it his favorite aircraft. He famously said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." He was talking about the brave Spitfire pilots who saved Britain in 1940 from German invasion. Churchill visited Spitfire Spitfire factories and air bases constantly to boost morale and thank workers and pilots personally. He understood that the Spitfire was the symbol that kept British spirits high during the darkest days. Churchill often watched dogfights from the ground during the Battle of Britain, despite the danger from falling debris. He insisted on being kept informed about Spitfire production numbers every single day without fail. When production slowed down, he personally intervened to fix problems and speed things up again. Churchill knew that losing the Spitfire meant losing the war and possibly losing Britain forever to Nazi Germany. His passion for the plane inspired an entire nation to keep fighting when surrender seemed easier. Bonus fact, almost called the Shrew. Before settling on Spitfire, the plane was almost called several ridiculous names that sound terrible today. One proposed name was the Shrew, which sounds more like an insult than a deadly fighter. Another suggestion was the Scarab, after a beetle, which would have been absolutely horrible. Designer Reginald Mitchell apparently suggested the Shrew himself before the bosses chose Spitfire instead. Other rejected names included the Nighthawk and the Wasp, which weren't much better than Shrew. Can you imagine pilots saying, "I fly a Shrew" instead of "I fly a Spitfire"? It sounds ridiculous. The marketing value of Spitfire became clear immediately once the public heard the aggressive name. It sounded fast, dangerous, and fierce. Exactly what Britain needed during desperate times in the 1940s. Mitchell eventually accepted the name even though he never liked it personally before his death. The name Spitfire became so famous that it's still used today for products, bands, and even people's names. From wooden sheds to ramming bombers at 20,000 feet, the Supermarine Spitfire proved that brilliant design and raw courage can change the course of history forever. This fighter didn't just win battles, it saved democracy and inspired generations with its beauty and power. If you learned something incredible today that you never knew before, smash that like button and subscribe for more historical facts that bring the past back to life.